Judith Mace walked to the center of the Cade Holdings atrium on a gray November morning and announced to 70 people that the company's founder had purchased her stepdaughter for $150. The room went very quiet in the way rooms only go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Caitlin Reeve stood near the north wall and felt every face in the atrium turn toward her. She had been recognized from the photographs taken at the Harvest Gala 3 weeks earlier. The ones that ran in the Herald's business section with a caption that named Rowan and left her unnamed, which was somehow worse. She had come this morning because staying away would have looked like an admission, and she was finished letting other people decide which rooms she stood in. Judith had counted on exactly that. She had always been very good at counting on what Caitlin couldn't bring herself to do. 8 months earlier, Caitlin had been standing in the cold outside the gate of her father's house on Riverview Crescent, holding a dishcloth from the kitchen, watching a woman she despised place a folded bill on a stone post like a tip left for a meal she'd found disappointing. The man on the other side of that gate had not reached for the money. He had looked at Caitlin. Just looked, steadily, the way a careful person reads something they mean to take seriously. She had thought about that look every day since. Who Rowan Cade actually was, that was the question Judith had never thought to ask. Hamish Reeve had built the house on Riverview Crescent in the years when his construction management firm had finally found its footing. A good decade's worth of work made permanent in stone and timber on a quiet street in South Calgary. Caitlin had grown up there believing the walls were a given, the way mountains are a given, the kind of thing that doesn't disappear simply because a person does. She had been wrong about that. Judith had been her father's wife for 4 years, efficient, composed, always wearing the correct expression for the occasion. She had looked at Caitlin the way someone looks at furniture that came with the property and doesn't quite suit the new decor. After the funeral, she sat Caitlin down in the study, her father's study, still faintly smelling of the cedar pencils he'd preferred, and explained in a patient, almost sorrowful tone that the estate had been more complicated than anyone had realized. There were debts restructured in the final year. Decisions Hamish had made quietly, Judith said, because he hadn't wanted to burden his daughter. What remained was held in a legal structure Judith understood, and Caitlin did not. Caitlin asked to see the will. Judith showed her a copy, notarized, clean, signed in a hand that looked like her father's, but sat too lightly on the page, too guided, too careful, as though the pen had traced a shape rather than driven it. Caitlin stared at that signature for a long time and said nothing, because saying something required proof, and proof required resources, and resources were precisely what Judith had spent 3 weeks making certain she didn't have. So she stayed, not out of hope, not out of weakness. She stayed because leaving meant surrendering the only thing she still possessed, which was proximity, to the study, to the filing cabinet, to whatever her father had left behind that Judith hadn't yet finished reorganizing. She told herself that patience was a strategy rather than a habit, and she ran the house in the meantime the way you keep a machine running while you figure out who actually owns it. She set the coffee before anyone came downstairs. She managed the cleaners, the repairs, the dry cleaning Tessa left in a pile by the front door still tagged from the boutique. No one used the word maid. No one had to. Judith simply stopped setting a place for Caitlin at the dinner table, and after enough months, the absence became a rule that didn't need to be written down. Tessa Mace was 26 and had learned early that cruelty is most comfortable when it wears the shape of a question. She never raised her voice. She left clothes on the bathroom floor and asked in front of company whether the dry cleaner had understood the instructions this time, in a tone that made it perfectly clear who had given those instructions and who would answer for them. She was never unkind by any measure she couldn't defend. She was simply never quite kind. What neither of them had considered was that Caitlin watched. She watched how Judith spent the last 20 minutes of every Sunday in the study with the door half closed. She watched new folders appear in the filing cabinet and old ones quietly disappear. Once she passed the hallway and found Tessa inside the study photographing pages off the desk with her phone, unhurried, undisguised. Their eyes met. Tessa turned the next page and kept going. Caitlin filed it away with everything else she couldn't yet prove. What she didn't see, Because Judith had never given her reason to see it was that she had stopped being an inconvenience and started being a liability. A daughter still living in that house was a daughter who could walk into a law office someday and say she had never left it. Judith needed her gone in a way that could not be reversed, and gone with someone else's hands on the final piece of it. That winter, a man began appearing along Riverview Crescent in the early evenings. He was somewhere past 50, tall, with a posture that didn't match the worn canvas jacket he wore or the heavy boots that had covered real ground before they came to this neighborhood. He walked slowly, sat on the low retaining wall near the corner, read from whatever he'd tucked under his arm. The neighborhood assembled an explanation for him within a fortnight, the way neighborhoods do. Someone said he was renting near the river flats. Someone else was almost certain he'd stepped back from something, though no one could say what. The version that stuck was that he was a man who'd had a full life and lost the shape of it. Nobody had confirmed anything. The coat was all anyone had actually seen, and the coat explained everything that needed explaining. Caitlin noticed him the way she noticed most things now, sideways, while carrying something else. Once, a grocery bag split against her hip on the walk up from the bus stop, and a tin rolled toward the curb. He crossed the street, collected it without asking, stacked everything back into her arms, and stepped away before she'd finished deciding whether to thank him. He waited until she nodded. Then he moved on. She thought about the restraint in that, the specific discipline of not filling silence with himself, for the better part of 2 days. His name she heard from him and no one else offered plainly, with no ceremony attached to it. Rowan Cade. He said it the way a man states a fact he has no particular attachment to. But things didn't add up, not dramatically, more like a measurement that's consistently off by the same degree, suggesting something is true that the surface of things denies. He read financial regulatory filings, not articles about markets, but the actual quarterly disclosures, annotating them in a fast, cramped hand that moved with the confidence of someone who had been doing this for decades. He used words like encumbrance and covenant the way you use words you've handled daily since your 20s. Once, when a dark SUV slowed at the corner, and the driver leaned forward with the unmistakable expression of someone who has just recognized an important face, Rowan stood, folded his paper, and had covered 30 feet before the window finished coming down. Caitlin filed that away too. Judith noticed him on a Thursday and made her decision by Saturday. She went out to the gate herself on a Sunday evening in her good gray coat, the one she wore when she wanted to look measured rather than wealthy, and she did not introduce herself. She had already concluded who she was dealing with, a man past his prime, alone, without a visible claim on anything in this neighborhood. A man like that, in her assessment, would be grateful for almost anything. "I'll pay you to take a problem off my hands," Judith said. The gate was between them. She did not lower her voice. "There's a young woman in my house who needs to leave it. She has no income, no prospects, no family who'll take her in. $150. You take her tonight, and you don't bring her back to this street." Rowan didn't answer immediately. Judith interpreted the silence as negotiation, which offended her. She explained that the figure was firm, that a man in his circumstances should understand she was offering a practical courtesy. Then she brought Caitlin out. Caitlin came because her name had been called, still holding the cloth from the kitchen, wearing the gray sweater she'd scrubbed the front hall tiles in that afternoon. She came around the corner and read the shape of the conversation before a word of it had been repeated for her. Judith at the gate with her chin up, a man on the other side she had never seen here at this hour. The particular stillness in Judith's posture that always meant a decision had already been made, and the world was being given a moment to confirm it. Tessa came out behind her mother, arms folded. Rowan looked at Caitlin for a long moment, not at the cloth or the sweater. He looked at her face the way a careful person looks at something they intend to understand. Caitlin looked back and found nothing she expected. No pity, no discomfort, no calculation of a man being handed something he hadn't asked for. He looked at her as though she were the subject of the sentence, rather than the thing under discussion. It was the first time in 2 years anyone had done that. Then he reached into the inside pocket of the canvas jacket, drew out a fold of bills, and placed $150 flat on top of the gatepost. Judith's hand covered it before it had fully settled. "Good," she said. "That's settled then." Tessa smiled, bright, quick, satisfied, the way someone smiles when they've been holding a line and finally get to deliver it. "150, she said. "So that's what you've been worth this whole time." Judith lifted a suitcase from just inside the gate, packed, latched, already waiting, because this decision had been made hours before she came outside. She set it down at Caitlin's feet with the flat sound of a bag that someone else has closed. "Everything's in there," Judith said. "Don't come back to the house." Then she turned and walked away. The gate stayed open behind them because neither of them expected it to matter. Caitlin stood at the post and looked at the suitcase. 2 years of running that house, and the whole of what Judith had decided still counted as hers fit into something one person could carry. That was what landed hardest, not the money, not Tessa's line, but the packing. Judith had folded her clothes. Judith had decided which of her belongings still counted as her belongings. The transaction at the gate had been a formality. The sentence had been carried out upstairs quietly sometime that afternoon. She picked up the suitcase herself. Nobody offered. They had walked 4 blocks before Caitlin set it down hard under a streetlight and turned. "Why did you pay her?" Rowan stopped. He didn't move any closer, and she noticed that too. "I didn't buy you," he said. She had named a price, the amount she'd take to let you walk out of that gate without a scene. Your suitcase was already packed before she came outside. The decision to remove you had been made hours ago. All that was left was what story she'd get to tell afterward. I placed the amount she named so that you could walk through that gate without it looking like she threw you out for nothing. She wanted to say she'd been paid. I let her have that because arguing at this gate at 10 o'clock at night would have cost you the night and changed nothing else. Caitlin said nothing. He continued evenly. "You don't owe me money. You don't owe me a conversation. Pick that up and go in any direction you want, and I won't follow. I'll tell you where I'm going, and you can decide whether that's the same direction." She counted what she had. $68 in her coat pocket. Tips from a summer job 2 years ago, never spent. A phone on a plan Judith controlled, which meant a phone that would be dead by morning. One aunt in Fredericton who had stopped picking up when the estate got complicated. A suitcase someone else had packed. Every road went back through that gate. Standing under the streetlight, she understood that for the first time with complete clarity, and it changed the shape of the night. "Where are you going?" she said. "A rented place near the river on Heron Street," he told her. 2 bedrooms, month to month, nothing in it worth taking. She could have the back room until she had wages of her own and somewhere better to put them. There was a lock on the door and she should use it. He said it with no warmth and no apparent investment in whether the offer appealed to her, the way you read out an address to someone who asked. "And what do you want?" she said. It came out the way you set something down carefully and wait to see if it moves. He considered it seriously, which she hadn't expected. "Nothing you'd be required to give," he said. "If that changes, you'll see it before I say anything, and you'll leave. I'd rather you plan on leaving. It'll make things easier for both of us." The house on Heron Street was exactly what he'd described: small, clean spare, a folding chair near the window, a stack of books where a coffee table might have been. The back bedroom had a bed, a lamp, a chest of drawers, and a lock that worked. Rowan set her suitcase inside the doorframe, showed her the thermostat, told her the hot water took a minute, and went back to the front room. Caitlin sat on the edge of the bed in her coat and understood that endurance, as a strategy, had produced exactly one outcome: $68 she was afraid to spend in a suitcase she hadn't packed. So the strategy changed. She found work at a bakery on Elbow Drive called Stanhope's, run by a woman named Hazel Dunbar, who had owned it for 20 years, and hired people based on whether they showed up when they said they would. Hazel asked nothing about the 2-year gap in Caitlin's work history. She put an apron in her hands and said to be there at 6. Caitlin worked 6 days the first week and made $212. She counted it 3 times in the back room beside the proofing racks before she believed it was hers. She opened an account at a credit union 2 streets over and deposited the whole of it and withdrew nothing. It was the first money she had earned since her father died. Judith had spent 2 years insisting she had no legitimate claim to anything, and the argument had worked because Caitlin had had nothing of her own to hold against it. $212 wasn't a fortune. It was a fact that no notarized document in a filing cabinet on Riverview Crescent could touch. She kept watching Rowan. The details accumulated steadily, the way a consistent measurement error eventually makes itself known. He read actual regulatory filings, dense quarterly disclosures that most people skip, and annotated them in cramped, fast handwriting with the assurance of someone who had been doing this for decades. He knew things a man in a rented house on Heron Street had no business knowing. When Hazel mentioned that her building's ownership was being restructured and she was worried about her lease, Caitlin repeated it at supper without expectation, and Rowan asked 3 precise questions about the entity structure and told her exactly what clause Hazel should demand in writing before she signed anything. Hazel followed the advice. She kept her lease. She asked Caitlin where she'd gotten that. Caitlin said a friend, and heard how thin it sounded. Cars still slowed sometimes, dark, large, moving too deliberately. Rowan would stop mid-sentence, look at nothing specific, and find a reason to face a different direction. The clearest instance came in March outside a hardware supplier near the rail crossing. A man in a good coat came out of the building, saw Rowan 20 feet away, and lit up the way people light up when they've met someone important once and haven't forgotten it. He raised his hand and came forward. Rowan turned down the alley beside the loading dock and was gone before the man had covered 10 feet. The man stood in the lot with the particular look of someone who has just stopped being certain about something they were certain of a moment ago. Caitlin was 40 feet away holding a bag of supplies for the bakery. That evening she told him about the will. She hadn't planned to. They had been in the kitchen for 20 minutes without speaking, which had become a comfortable thing, and it came out in 5 minutes flat. The study, the documents spread across the desk, the debts nobody could itemize, and the notarized copy with a signature that sat too flat on the page. "I've known since the week after the funeral," she said. "Knowing and being able to do something about it are 2 different things. She kept me in a position where I couldn't." Rowan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question, whether her father had used the same law firm for a long time. She said 14 years. He nodded slowly and didn't say anything more about it. So she asked him directly, "What did you actually do before you came here?" He closed the report he was reading. She noticed because he usually kept a finger in the page. "A job I'm not ready to go back to." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He offered nothing further, and she didn't push. She had thought in the first weeks that he was hiding something shameful. By March, she had begun to suspect the opposite, that what he was hiding was something the rest of the world would find enviable, and that was harder to sit with. A shameful secret would have made him a straightforward kind of mystery. The call came on a Wednesday evening in April. His phone, a plain thing that almost never rang, lit up on the arm of the folding chair. He answered, listened for about 20 seconds, said only that he'd be there, and was out the door in 4 minutes with no bag and no explanation beyond telling her to lock up behind him. He didn't come back that night or the next. By Thursday afternoon, Caitlin had gone from irritated to something she didn't want to name. She checked the front room. His books were where he'd left them. On the notepad by the door, written in the fast hand she recognized, was a phone number with a local Calgary exchange. She called it from the alley behind Stanhope's before her morning shift. A woman answered on the second ring, Cade Holdings, Mr. Larkin's office. Caitlin hung up. She stood in the alley for a while. Then she walked 11 blocks north on Center Street to the Cade Holdings building, a tower of dark glass she had walked past 100 times without once thinking about whose name was cut into the stone above the entrance, and went through the front doors in her work apron with flour on her left sleeve. The lobby had the particular quality of spaces designed to make you aware of your own scale. She made it perhaps 40 feet before something shifted in the room ahead of her, people rising from chairs, conversations stopping. A woman at the reception desk touched her earpiece and straightened her posture. Along the far wall, elevator doors opened and a cluster of people in dark suits came out quickly, moving with the organized purpose of people who have rehearsed this. Outside through the glass, a line of dark vehicles pulled to the curb. Caitlin turned to watch the rear door of the second one open. Rowan stepped out. He was not wearing the canvas jacket. He wore a charcoal suit that had been made for his specific dimensions, and he crossed the lobby without slowing, and the entire assembled row of executives rose before he reached them. A man of about 60 with silver hair fell in at his left shoulder and began speaking in a low, continuous stream, passing across a folder. Rowan took it without looking at him, opened it while walking, gave an instruction that sent 3 people in different directions. Caitlin caught fragments as the group moved past. The board, the amendment, Tuesday, and the silver-haired man saying clearly, "They'll want to hear it from you directly, Mr. Cade." She did not move. She stood in the middle of the lobby of one of the largest private holding companies in the country, in a bakery apron, holding a bus pass, and understood what she had been circling for 3 months. Cade Holdings was named after him, not a grandfather, not a predecessor, him. He was the founder. He was the controlling shareholder. He had been absent from public life for the better part of a year, and everyone in that lobby knew it, and had been waiting. In the meantime, he had been living on Heron Street and telling her the hot water needed a minute. She had been buying his groceries with tip money. Rowan was 10 steps past her when he stopped. She watched him register it, not her face first, but something at the edge of his attention that didn't belong. Then the correction, then the turn. The people around him kept moving 2 full strides before they realized he wasn't with them. He looked at her across the marble floor in a suit that cost more than she had earned in her entire life. Caitlin found she was not surprised. That was the part that found her off balance. She had known for weeks. In the way you know something you haven't let yourself finish, and not finishing it had felt like a choice. Finishing it meant that every quiet thing he'd done, every name on an envelope, every piece of lease advice, became a decision made by a man who could afford anything. That was a different thing from what she'd thought they were. She turned and walked out before he reached her. He came to Heron Street that evening alone, wearing the canvas jacket again, which she found almost insulting. "For months," she said, "I handed you money for groceries, and you told me to save it for bus fare. You sat across from me in that kitchen and let me feel like we were on the same ground." Yes. Say something that isn't yes. So he did. It took most of an hour. His marriage had ended 6 years ago, and afterward he had lost people, not to anger but to the slow discovery of what they had actually been standing next to all along. Friends who turned out to be positions, advisors who agreed with him in rooms and repositioned in corridors. He had gone 2 years without a single conversation in which the other person didn't want something that required his name or his signature. After long enough, you lose the ability to separate the person from the power attached to them. That, he said, was what had frightened him. He could no longer tell whether he was worth anything with the company subtracted from the equation. So he subtracted it. He handed operational control to his management team, kept his shareholding and his title and nothing else, and walked out with a rented house and a worn jacket, and no access to the machinery that had been making people courteous to him for 25 years. His chief of operations, Oliver Larkin, the silver-haired man from the lobby, had one standing instruction: call only if the board moved against the founder in his absence. 11 months later, they moved. And in the meantime, Caitlin said, "You ran an experiment on a street where I happen to live." "I ran it on myself," Rowan said. "You were on the street, so was your stepmother." He looked at her steadily. 11 months of people meeting a man with nothing visible behind him. Almost all of them had behaved the way Judith had at that gate, but not everyone. "You chose to help me before you knew anything," he said. "That's all of it. And I've spent 4 months not saying it because the moment I say it, it sounds like a transaction, and it isn't." Caitlin believed him. That was the inconvenient part. She sat in a cold kitchen on Heron Street and found that she believed every word, and that it changed nothing about what came next. 2 weeks later, he offered, carefully, with no pressure attached, to move her out of Heron Street. A proper apartment near the university district, a position in the company if she wanted one, or tuition, or simply money. He laid it out like a man who had thought hard about how to make the offer contain nothing that would need to be repaid, and who was genuinely puzzled that this wasn't sufficient. She declined all of it. "It's not about owing you," she said. She put both hands flat on the table. "Judith stood at that gate and named a price for me, and she took money for it. If I move into a place you pay for and take a job you create for me, then she was right. Not about the number, about the kind of thing I am. Something that gets handed from one person to another and valued by whoever happens to be holding it at the time." She kept the room on Heron Street. She kept the 6 o'clock shifts. Hazel made her shift lead in June, and the raise was $1.10 an hour, and Caitlin cared about it in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had ever ridden an elevator in the Cade Holdings tower. Judith came to Stanhope's 11 days after the Harvest Gala photographs ran in the paper. She arrived at the slow hour in a coat chosen to look modest and waited at a corner table until Caitlin came out from the back. Then she performed something clearly rehearsed: remorse, exhaustion, a widow overwhelmed after her husband's passing, mistakes made under impossible pressure, a family that could still be repaired. Caitlin listened to all of it. Then she asked Judith to leave. Judith's expression reorganized itself. It happened quickly, the way someone moves to the second tactic when the first one has run its course. "Let me tell you what I'm going to give to the press," Judith said. "A wealthy, powerful man came to a family home and paid $150 for a young woman. Those are the facts. I'll say he approached me at my gate. I'll say I was a grieving widow and I was frightened. I'll say money changed hands and my stepdaughter left with him that night. I'll cry on camera, and I'm very good at that. He goes into the papers as a man who paid for a woman. The company goes with him. And you go in as the girl who was handed over and decided she liked the arrangement." She set her card on the table. "Come home. Sign a proper settlement, your interest in the estate documented and protected. Do that and the story dies in this room. 2 weeks." After the door closed, Caitlin sat alone in an empty bakery at 3:30 in the afternoon and saw the whole shape of it. She had built something real out of $212 and a lock that worked, and the gate on Riverview Crescent had followed her the entire distance. Patient, the way Judith was always patient, holding the one weapon Caitlin could not dismantle, because every fact in it was true. She told Rowan that evening. She repeated the threat in Judith's exact words, including the line about crying on camera, and watched him take it in without any change in his face except a slight tightening around the jaw. "I can make it go away," he said. "Not by paying her. There are options that would make her decision to approach a reporter the worst one she's ever made. And then it's a story about a billionaire crushing a widow," Caitlin said. "Probably." "No." She sat down across from him. "She wants my signature. That's the whole point of the threat. She doesn't actually want a scandal. She wants the pressure of one to make me sign. If I sign it, everything she did to my father's estate gets covered over by my own hand. That's what she's buying with the threat." He didn't argue. She understood later that he'd already known. The 2 weeks ran out on a Friday. Judith did exactly what she'd said she would. The story went up Thursday evening on a site that traded in exactly that kind of thing, and it did not read like a rumor. It read like a testimony. A grieving widow approached at her own gate by a man she did not recognize. Money placed on the post. Her stepdaughter leaving with him that night. Every fact was accurate. That was the engineering of it. Judith hadn't invented anything. She had only changed who was frightened and who was in control. By Monday, the phrase $150 was circulating on its own, detached from any context that might complicate it. Inside Cade Holdings, it moved faster and had sharper teeth. Rowan had been back 5 months, and there were people on his board who had spent his absence growing comfortable, and who now had a reason to say the word judgment in closed-door meetings. The company's annual shareholder briefing went ahead as scheduled. Canceling it would have been read as an answer. Which was how it came back to Tuesday morning, November, the Cade Holdings atrium. Judith standing in the center aisle, Caitlin near the north wall, 70 people holding very still. Rowan raised one hand almost casually, and the 2 staff members who had started moving toward Judith stopped where they stood. He walked to the front of the room, not to the podium and not to the microphone. and stood on the open floor in front of his board and his shareholders and turned to face the room. "She's telling the truth about the money," he said. "I want that on the record first because everything I say after it is going to be checked." Nobody moved. In February, $150 was placed on a gate post on Riverview Crescent. This woman accepted it. "Those are facts, and I won't pretend otherwise." He paused. "What she hasn't told you is what it was for. It was not a price for a person. It was the amount she had named to let her stepdaughter leave a house her own father had built. Caitlin Reeve had been living in that house for 2 years without wages and without legal standing. Her stepmother had already packed her suitcase that afternoon. It was latched and waiting inside the gate before I was offered any arrangement at all. The decision to remove her had been made hours earlier. The only thing still open was how it would be described afterward. I placed the amount she named because arguing at that gate at 10 o'clock at night would have cost Caitlin the night and changed nothing else. She has not taken $1 from me since. She has worked 6 days a week in a bakery on Elbow Drive since March." Judith understood she was losing the room and reached for what she had left. "He is one of the wealthiest men in this province, and I am a widow," she said. "Who do you imagine this room is going to believe?" "That's a fair question," Rowan said. "So let's not make it about belief." Oliver Larkin came through the side doors with 2 associates and a document case. He did not come to the front. He stopped 10 feet back and stood there holding it, which was somehow more effective than any podium. In July, our legal team reviewed the public record on the Reeve estate, not the private record, the public one. Property transfer registrations at land titles, documents available to any adult who walks into the appropriate office and asks. There are 2 property transfers recorded in the 9 weeks following Hamish Reeve's death, both notarized by the same individual whose commission was suspended the following year for reasons also on the public record. The signature on one of those transfers does not match the signature on documents Hamish Reeve filed with the city of Calgary 18 months before his death. And the will admitted to probate is not the will he executed. He executed one in the spring before he died and lodged a copy with the firm that had handled his affairs for 14 years. That copy was never withdrawn. It leaves the house and his controlling interest in Reeve Construction Management to his daughter. Caitlin heard it from across the atrium and did not move. She had known since the week after the funeral, standing in that study, looking at a signature that sat too flat on the page. The proof had been sitting in a government office the entire time, available to any adult who could walk in and request it. She had never had the standing to ask, because Judith had spent 2 years making certain of exactly that. "Everything I've described was submitted to the Crown Prosecution Office on Saturday," Rowan said, "before Mrs. Mace chose to come into this building this morning." Judith's face did not collapse. It emptied, which was different and more complete. She had come into this atrium holding $150 like a blade, absolutely certain it was the sharpest thing in the room. It was the $150 that had brought her here, that had put her in front of these cameras, insisting that everyone look closely at what had happened at a gate on Riverview Crescent. She had spent 8 months building every reason for people to examine that transaction carefully. She had been the one making certain everyone looked. 2 of Oliver's people walked her to the door. She said nothing further. The last image the cameras caught was a woman in a modest coat going through a revolving door, and then she was gone. The board item concerning Rowan's judgment was never brought to a vote. 2 directors who had spent the autumn using that word resigned before the winter meeting. The legal process took 8 months. Caitlin ran all of it herself. She hired a small firm on the north side of the city, paid the retainer from her own account, and when the retainer ran short, she borrowed against the expected settlement rather than take $1 from Rowan. She wanted the record to show that Caitlin Reeve had recovered her father's estate, not that it had been recovered for her. The distinction was invisible to almost everyone and was the only part she cared about. Tessa separated from her mother in the 2nd month and retained independent counsel. She cooperated fully and produced years of her mother's correspondence and photographed documents. Assembled, it turned out, by a young woman who had understood for some time that a day like this might come, and had been making quiet preparations for which side of it she'd be standing on. She never reached out to Caitlin directly. Caitlin never sought her out. Whatever had existed between them had been settled at a gate in February with 8 words. So that's what you've been worth this whole time. Judith was charged with forgery and fraud in the execution of a will. She fought it for 8 months and eventually ran out of procedural ground. The house on Riverview Crescent was returned to Caitlin's name the following spring, along with her father's controlling interest in Reeve Construction Management. She sold the house. She had stood long enough inside those walls to know she could not build a version of her life within them. It sold in 3 weeks to a family from out of province who had never heard any of the names involved, and she took only her father's drafting table and a photograph of him from the year the company was founded. What she did with the rest didn't hold the newspaper's interest for long, which suited her. She bought stanhopes from Hazel Dunbar, who had been trying to retire for 4 years and had never trusted anyone else with the staff. Caitlin kept every employee. She kept the 6 o'clock opening and kept working the counter 3 mornings a week because she needed to know whether the ovens were running correctly, and she liked knowing. Within 18 months, there were 2 locations. She ran both of them from her father's drafting table. Rowan asked her the question that Autumn in the front room on Heron Street, a place he had long since stopped needing to rent but had not given up. He did it imperfectly, for a man who negotiated for a living. He said he wanted her in his life as the person he loved, and that he had waited until she owned something so the answer couldn't be mistaken for gratitude by either of them. Caitlin said yes. Not because of what he ran or what he was worth or what he had been willing to do in an atrium full of cameras. She said yes because she had chosen him in February on a dark street 4 blocks from a gate, when he was a man in a worn jacket that an entire neighborhood had already decided it understood. She had looked at him and found something that didn't match the explanation they'd all settled on, and she had paid attention to that. And she had been right. 3 years after that gate on Riverview Crescent, Caitlin Reeve had her own business, her own name on things that required no one else's signature, and a life built on ground she had broken herself. Judith had believed that $150 could price a human being, that $150 became the precise instrument of her undoing, the thing she carried into an atrium full of witnesses, absolutely certain it was a weapon, when it was the only object in her possession that could not be examined without exposing everything standing behind it. She had judged Rowan by a jacket. She had judged Caitlin by a number. She had made both assessments confidently, out loud, in front of witnesses, and she had never once stopped to consider that she might be looking at either of them incorrectly. That was the error she never recovered from. Not the greed, not the forgery, not the years of patient construction. All of that might have held indefinitely. The error was simpler. She had looked at 2 people, decided she already knew what they were, and stopped paying attention. The truly costly mistake was never the crime, it was the certainty.